Hi everyone, welcome to Get Out of Midsomer, Horror in Britain's Empire. This paper was presented as part of Dr. Sam Hurst's Romancing the Gothic series this month as well. So I thought I'd put a version on my channel as well, but you also find it on their channel too. And I'll put links to that channel in the description, but also in this video as well. This paper is based on my earlier Medium article, and it's really about horror as a commentating device for thinking about the colonial history of Britain's countryside. It's part memoir, as someone who spent my childhood years there, part historical media inquiry, and part speculation. Growing up, it was obvious to me how the countryside takes up a big space in Britain's imagination. What poets William Blake what poet William Blake called a green and pleasant land, and A.E. Housman referred to Shropshire as the land of lost content, the countryside almost as unspoiled terrain. At school in Northamptonshire, in the countryside, and it was a private school as well, my introduction to page poetry was through the White Canon, which I actually grew to enjoy eventually. One of my favourites being the war poet Rupert Brooke's The Soldier, where at the front during World War One, he is longing for home and the foreign fields that are forever England. On my undergraduate degree, which was a creative writing programme, though filled with English literature modules, we studied William Wordsworth's classic lines written above Tintern Abbey as a lyrical poem about escape. Furthermore, to writers like Robert Frost, Ted Hughes, Seamus Heaney, Thomas Hardy, and a lot of these white men using the natural environment as escapism. I often think to Daffodils as well, also by Wordsworth. So really a lot of these white men waxing lyrical about escaping to the country. To a lot of these poets, England was its country and its countryside was England, which is how I learned it in the school curriculum as well. That was pining for a world that doesn't really exist. Um, On Thursday, the 28th of October, 1982, Black artists and students and teachers made their way to Wolverhampton Polytechnic for what was dubbed as the first national Black art convention in Britain. The organisers were art students, so many of them were teenagers at the time or final years in their early 20s, who wanted to challenge the British art world, and the art historians who said there was no history in Africa before the arrival of Europeans. Many of these artists were children of the Caribbean arrivals who had come during the 50s and 60s, who in Britain had very different experiences of the country to their parents. Ingrid Pollard, whose family came from Guyana in 1956, responded to the call for that conference and was one of the few who wasn't a student. Pollard, living in London at the time, one of her housemates knew the family of the historian G.M. Trevelyan, who had a large house in the Langdale Valley in the Lake District in the north of England. It was on these excursions into the rural Pollard began to experiment with art and photography, later combining ideas of race, empire, and the countryside. Her questions of blackness and Englishness in the rural would become the muse for Pastoral Interlude, 5 hand-tinted silver prints of black men and women in a rural scene from St Andrews in Scotland to the Lake District and many more. This was exhibited in 1987, and what Pollard did in the late 80s was trailblazing for a conversation on rural racism that has now become mainstream, including John Garland and Neil Chakraborty's book of the same name, Corinne Fowler's book, The Green and Pleasant Land, and even my own work as well on empire and Jane Austen. Pollard's questions of racism, the countryside, and empire were representations of of moments amid her enjoyment of the countryside, where whiteness would show its face. She'd noticed that white people would sometimes stare at her as if she didn't belong there. So things like that. Raymond Williams also studied the countryside areas and how they were analysed in English literature, coming up with the term retrospective regret to explain how these novelists and poets would pine for the good old days. It shows that many white people and black folks using the countryside are living in very different realities to one another. I often look to Louisa Adra Parker's work here too, and the spaces being made by different community interest companies. For example, Black Girls Hike as well in the UK, Anti-Racist Cumbria. There's also, I think, Black Scottish Adventurers too. So I'm interested in how history links with the present. So that's how I came to see the countryside as a site for possible horror films that commentate on colonial history. Being a black person talking about this, I've often been met with genuine curiousness and denial from both white and black people, shocked that black lives exist beyond major English cities, and that some of us even like where we live, as this is where I grew up as well and went to school. So additionally, that due to geography and not culture or race, I might possibly have more to say on many of these white rural texts, like The Railway Children, original book by E. Nesbitt, than much of the black British writing canon that so often centres the inner cities. In contrast, I had a great time growing up and going camping in places like Devon and Suffolk, farmers markets in Northants, while also exploring provincial cities like Lichfield, which is about 20 minutes from Birmingham, also, which is where my Jamaican grandparents settled as well, as part of the Caribbean migration. Also, as a child, quite enjoying Stratford-upon-Avon, which is between Coventry and Birmingham as well. School trips to Swanage in Dorset, Castleton in Derbyshire, and the Anglo-Saxon burial ground Sutton Hoo, also in Suffolk. So my concept of blackness did not actually come from the hubs like of London's Brixton and Shepherd's Bush, or even Handsworth in Birmingham, although I was aware of them, but the pockets I saw in towns and the countryside. Adjacent to these very leafy local experiences, my exposure to popular culture followed that tradition, including through films like The Sound of Music, The King and I, and engaging with the landscape of classic adaptations of things like Pride and Prejudice, Wuthering Heights, and the BBC's adaptation of George Eliot's Middlemarch with Dorothea Brooke and Edward Casaubon at Lowick Manor. Those sorts of images were more familiar to me than the densely built areas of London and Birmingham and so on. In fact, the first time I visited Brixton wasn't until 2023 because I had no reason to be there or to go there. So yeah, so there's a lot of that to consider as well. It was only after my childhood I began to connect the dots between colonial enslavement and the landscapes I grew up in. Corinne Fowler's Green and Pleasant Land, and her more recent book, Our Island Stories, illuminates not only how places, just like the ones I navigated as a youth, connect to the lives and deaths of my enslaved ancestors, but how these places impacted the prospects of white working class landless Britons, where the same landowning classes oppressing agricultural labourers in programs like Poldark were also the ones who held enslaved people in the colonies. It was only as an undergrad I started to read all these sort of like scholarly academic books. I sort of knew about some of this stuff already, just from talking to people and listening and hearing the oral stories as well. In Northampton, we have a statue of Charles II, who was the equivalent of the CEO of the Human Trafficking Slave Trading Corporation, the Royal Africa Company, while at the same time he is celebrated for funneling money into the rebuilding of All Saints Church after the Great Fire of Northampton in 1675. As Corinne also states that the men who worked for the East India Company or owned plantations were often the very same people who enclosed common land, for example, like our Salsey Forest in Northampton at the time in the 17th century, became MPs and denied ordinary people the vote, people who ran cotton factories and copper mines. So this paper aims to reframe how historical costume dramas have written these people as benevolent entrepreneurs, including white women in the work of Jane Austen, and show how horror might be a way to connect the present day heritage sites to the colonial past and public audiences in ways TV and film dramas aren't prepared to do or actually positioned to. The lakes, the ornate gardens, the landscapes, the portraits, the wide rooms, and the tall ceilings are a gift of media makers that, when combined with the the academic historical investigation, allow us to write colonial history back into heritage away from trauma narratives so common on screen as a history of white people. White supremacy needs scaffolding to maintain people's belief in it. If you are going to perform whiteness, you need a mythology, a story, an imagination of some sort. You need the simplest version of the idea, one that, in the words of Eames from Inception, will grow naturally in the subject's mind. What grows more naturally than fear? Can you scare racism out of people? No. But if you plant the seeds deeply enough, they might experience something worse than fear, doubt. So the racists will begin to doubt that their racism can hold up, for lack of a better term. So my childhood in the sticks was ice and fire. I experienced the ice of racism, but also the fire of belonging that I don't get from the inner cities. Exposed to the English literature canon as a child, then as a teenager doing my GCSE on Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, I later began to think about how we are never told how characters like the Lintons made their money. At Thrushcross Grange. Wuthering Heights is a Gothic novel largely set in the Yorkshire moors between 1801 and 1802, with flashbacks to the 1770s by the narrator, Nellie, well within the years of chattel slavery. It's a Gothic novel published in 1847 about the impassioned yet toxic love between the main characters Heathcliff, whose supporting character, Mr. Earnshaw, brings back from Liverpool in the 1770s, adopting him, and then Mr. Earnshaw's daughter, Cathy. Heathcliff develops a bond with her, and their love was complicated by his social class and her later marriage to the rich Edgar Linton. When Mr. Earnshaw dies, his son Hindley inherits his estate, and Heathcliff is mistreated and abused, ultimately ending with him leaving and years later returning as a wealthy man seeking revenge. My questions here are about how the Lintons and Heathcliff got wealthy, while readers of the book and viewers of the adaptation are told to just stay with it. My interest is adaptation rather than the novel, since film and TV could have adapted books like this with a more critical lens rather than to just follow the canon. So this is set before the slave owners were compensated in the 1830s and years before the trading in Africans was abolished as well. So in the 2011 Andrea Arnold adaptation, Heathcliff is cast as a black actor who Mr. Earnshaw brings back from Liverpool in a time where there were many people living in Britain accumulating colonial profits or psychologically divorced from the terror. We call those people absentee enslavers or absentee slave owners, depending on your point of view. Wuthering Heights' brooding atmosphere, isolated landscapes, and talk of ghosts would allow any filmmaker with a bit of historical knowledge to show how the ghosts of slavery or enslavement might meander the landscapes surrounding the Yorkshire moors, certainly in readings of white property or whiteness as ownership, in the words of Cheryl Harris. In adaptations of Victorian novels, empire and its ties to in-text property are dismissed in favour of escapism. Topics like colonialism don't make good romance. It upsets the good vibes. So, for example, in Mansfield Park, Austen dallies with the slave trade, but doesn't go into great detail. But taking the British country estate as filming locations with empire relegated to the backdrop, it leaves space to speak on the silence. Walking around country estates, as I have done, I see the rural Caribbean. Charlene White's documentary Empire's Child tracks the ghosts of enslaved people on her family tree on Jamaican plantations, in the same way as country estates greenwash the Caribbean. Places made by those profits while also erasing their presence, like ghosts. Likewise, Patricia Williams found her 2 times great-grandmother was enslaved by Tennessee lawyer Austen Miller. In White and Williams's investigations, I witnessed the supernatural silhouettes of oppressor and oppressed. This hit closer to home, as my name, the Ventour name, shows up in UCL's slave trade compensation records for the parish of St. George, Grenada. In these names, I see whiteness as property as well in the lives of my ancestors. So the diligent work of UCL historians is also a history of phantoms and the violence of the economy upheld by enslavers from the lower middle class to aristocrats. So the slave compensation records show how archives may render the voices of enslaved people ghostly. We see these claims of mostly white slave owners, sometimes where they lived, but never the voices of enslaved people. Literary critic Saidiya Hartman talks about the challenges of finding the human of Black people in slave archives that focus on their status as property. Hartman contends with the ways arts can lift spirits, animating the groans and cries of the enslaved from the erasure imposed by those who wrote the history books. My family name shows up in the UCL records, but I could not find the human. But I found the records of accounts and evidence to how nearly 45% of all claims were made by women, like those in the Jane Austen stories as well. So, in a time in which historical archives are also being deleted, science fiction can also be a space to play with narrative. For example, and I quote here, if aliens are interfering with the space-time continuum, writes journalist Amanda A. Prescott, it's very obvious Doctor Who takes a more liberal path in terms of historical fiction, and it's clearly in the alternative history category. In 1814, frost fairs took place across London, which became part of the premise for the episode Thin Ice. The capital's big freeze-up made the Thames compellingly attractive to ice skaters and performers, which was adapted by writer Sarah Dollard. But this time there's something lurking under the Thames, aliens. Also, set in 1816, The Haunting of the Villa Diodati also shows yet another storyline of extreme weather patterns being used as a plot device or based on historical facts, dubbed A Year Without Summer because volcanic ash covered lots of the sky. At the Switzerland Villa, the Doctor, then Jodie Whittaker, and her comrades meet authors Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron on the night Mary Shelley was inspired to write Frankenstein. Inside, strange things happen, including an encounter with ghosts. The place of Ryan Sinclair, so played by Tosin Cole, in Villa, and Bill Potts, so Pearl Mackie in Thin Ice, offers insight into thinking about the Black presence in the Regency as well. But before more recent campaigns over the whiteness of university history curriculums, New Who post-2005 had been doing lots of work of not only using lesser-known histories as a backdrop for alien events, but using the gaps within erasure to expand on the inner world that may not show up vividly in archives, which certainly came up in Martha's time when she, as a Black woman, is central to several storylines that have later been discussed in the context of Black history and racism. One of the big ones being the two-parter Human Nature and the Family of Blood, which is set just before the First World War, right in the countryside in the rural England, with Martha being in the middle of it as a Black woman as well. But today I'll focus on this episode, Fear Her. So Fear Her, written by Matthew Graham, aired in 2006, and it's one I always come back to because it takes something really quite innocent and makes it sinister. The lonely child, Chloe Webber, has the power to make people disappear just by drawing them. It got me to think about what if we applied that to period dramas, like the letters and invoices that maybe have gone between Britain and the Caribbean. What if the content of those invoices came to life, scuttling out of the ink, causing havoc in the countryside? Either in the 19th century or more today, as those places are used as heritage sites. These are just open questions as someone who is creative but also likes history. We might then also consider the US horror Jordan Peele's critically acclaimed Get Out, and the very innocentish scene where Protagonist Chris Washington takes a photograph of the only other black guy at a white garden party, and that dude is missing as well, and just everything just stops. He's brainwashed by this white woman, and it's really a metaphor. Chris is later entangled with his white girlfriend's family, and their sinister plot at their country estate in the middle of nowhere, far from civilization. This image of Lakeith Stanfield's character, Logan, is an effect of the sunken place before Chris gets got by whiteness. What got me about this is how easily this allegory translates into Britain. From the black men that marry white and forget where they come from, and thus enjoy the whiteness, to the workplace where black colleagues may step on each other to impress the white boss. I think it goes deeper than this as well. In the countryside, where that image of Chris falling through space can be like black folks swallowed up by the colonial histories and the spirits of the rural estates. The sunken place doesn't hear our screams, unable to move or speak. It's the whiteness of death that in the countryside leaves us looking for the human as well. Recent texts are like Get Out, as I just mentioned, but also Nia DaCosta's Candyman sequel, and also Alex Garland's Men, show the horror in people and places. Yet what about objects? In Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, the character Dr. Lars Pinfield, played by Northamptonshire comic James Acaster, says any emotionally charged object can contain a ghost, as long as it's experienced some sort of horrific event. So what if we thought about the objects of slave owners this way? That every object owned and touched by them can harbour the energy of the plantation. Hollywood has been able to show how racism can be discussed using horror also to include Lovecraft Country and its talk of chattel enslavement, ghosts impinging on the present of Jim Crow laws in the American South. But what about Britain? Ghosts in parchment, invoices, a carriage, unseen in the land, the fields, the lakes, the portraits, the wide rooms, the tall ceilings, apparition enslavers and enslaved, poltergeists angered by white credit. What if the portrait started to move? So the erasure of black voices and thus our humanity speaks to how we were seen as beyond the possibility of the human. In his debate of The Exorcist from 1973, James Baldwin discusses the absurdity of whiteness being that white people must go to the cinema to see the devil, while black people see them on the street, in the police, landlords, housewives, football players, and even drug addicts, and religious leaders. They're politicians, and even in the mirror as well. The idea of the devil making no other human real. But reflecting on The Exorcist, Baldwin further also discusses how the mindless and hysterical banality of the evil presented is the most terrifying thing about the film. The Americans should certainly know more about evil than that. If they pretend otherwise, they are lying, and any black person can call them on this lie. They who have been treated as the devil recognize the devil when they meet. The imagery of black people as monsters is uncomfortably familiar. At this point in the 70s, there were films like Blackula and Blackenstein made by white folks showing how Hollywood had a certain perception of us. In Britain, I would also argue the same thing, that on country estates, walkers and staff alike have a certain perception of black visitors and staff members as well. Black experiences there show us that our murderers sometimes come with smiles. But can we tell the difference between the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real? Is it important to see the differences? My original Medium article took inspiration from Alex Garland's Men to think about the countryside as a living, breathing thing, and the film is a commentary on the patriarchal, violent energies that can fill up rooms, spaces and places and people. How it's depicted in Men is how I remember it growing up. It was in the pubs and the war memorials, village cricket, fetes and country greens. A reproduction of the white male gaze, in the words of Laura Mulvey, that can totally swallow up those viewed as the other. It revisits white male entitlement to spaces even in proximity to white women who have their own set of privileges and associations with their terrorizing of black and brown people across society. In the 2022 horror, the rural is a character secondary to Jessie Buckley's Harper Marlowe, depending on the kindness of others. What were white men prepared to do to protect their access to power? Beginning in the London with a domestic violence situation, viewers follow Harper's escape to the rural ideal in a secluded village called Cotson in Hertfordshire. Men, has Rory Kinnear, play about 10 different characters, and very much in the afterlife of James McAvoy in Split. Um, and it's really an embodiment, he's really an embodiment of the phrase, all men are the same, or even more critically, men are trash. And the whataboutery of not all men. But Garland's film shows that it really is all men, both the very violent perpetrators and those who stand by and say nothing. It is a film that is about male masculinity and its various forms juxtaposed with the rural calm, as we know, was a place expanded by colonial profit and violence against the farm, against enslaved people and so on, but also the white working class labourers on the common land across the UK as well, as I mentioned earlier. Harper rents a small country house to heal from her experiences in London, now as a victim survivor, fleeing abuse, only to then go to a village where all the men are the same and a house is haunted by patriarchy. This use of geography is what I would really like to see in films about the slave trade, using country estates to talk about the white collar terror of the economy during the 19th century, in the same way Garland did on patriarchy. In Ghostly Matters, Avery Gordon calls this haunting as inheritance. In recent times, although there has been a call out by Black viewers to have fewer texts about Black trauma films, or fewer texts about Black trauma, sorry, following things like 12 Years a Slave and Django Unchained and so on. Proportionally, we do not actually get that many of those films. But when they are being made, they are Oscar bait, and so it may feel like there's loads of them. Black cinema is not a genre, but representations of Black lives that get taken seriously are often just films, even in 2025, that stereotype us. One way to decenter that would be to write stories about the slave trade that focus on the actions of white people here in Britain and the violence of the economy. Horror is a better place to do that than drama, and lean on that history. Thousands of entries in the UCL records, for example, over the standard Regency romance, focus on women's love lives, not how capacity and space to have love was upheld by profits made by enslavement and proximity to colonialism as well. So Black people in Britain today are used to being seen as monsters, and those stories of racism in the sticks, in some cases, are very much in the macabre. A day trip to the beach, Sunday lunch in a village pub, or even walking around country estates. I didn't know it then, but the way I grew up and doing lots of these things with my Jamaican godmother and my godbrother was really quite activist on her part in rural Northamptonshire. And also my parents and my family taking us camping and so forth. I was none the wiser as a child that we weren't supposed to be doing these things. The sideways glances, feelings of unease, and being viewed as abnormal, like monsters that go bump under the bed. In white people's imaginations, we are viewed as monsters, upsetting the rural ideal. So what horror is in a great place to do is decenter the visceral images of Black pain that we have seen in the American South and the Caribbean, rather and putting the focus on writing stories that show the building and the construction of Victorian Britain, the making of the private sector and our modern economy off the backs of enslaved labour and other colonial enterprises. For so long, colonialism has not been told from the position of economics, or there are other perspectives that need to be heard. So the countryside occupies a special place in my heart as someone who, although did not live there, I went to school there, and I grew up in it as well. So, but it's a place as a green and pleasant land for the wealthy white Britons. It is also an ideal space for creatives to think about how there are horror stories to be told about the invoices, the correspondence, and the buildings of country estates that can help educate people on Britain's history. For most of us who grew up in the UK, our formal schooling probably only gave us a thin exposure to histories of the British Empire. Um, to fully understand it, there are other interpretations and approaches that I think creatives can look at. Jennifer Kent's film The Nightingale is a horror film situated around the violence and terror the British inflicted upon the indigenous people of Tasmania, but also the Irish women that were sent there, including through rape and sexual assault. But what The Nightingale does is take us into the site of the terror, not where the power really was. I really want films set in Britain's present or past that look at the violence done at home through the economics, so the double entry bookkeeping and the drawing of borders, which are horror stories done through the pen, not the sword, in the countryside, but also places like Whitehall in London as well. Um, my argument with horror films and absentee colonial violence would be challenged by the British government and the so-called war on woke, where they would say I'm rewriting the literary canon in my millennial image. When British heritage organisation the National Trust released their report into their properties links with colonialism and enslavement, 59 Conservative MPs calling themselves the Common Sense Group declared a battle for Britain. The report also prompted many members to provide knee-jerk reactions to pull their £100 subscription fees to the organisation as well. At that time, in 2020, it showed how many believed that history was there to make them feel comfortable. But what the report does is put the countryside in context and tells us what is. Beginning with the country houses would be a step forward towards a Black British psychogeography by reframing colonial history as part of the history of white people told from the Black gaze. In 1955, philosopher Guy Debord popularized the term psychogeography to describe the study of the specific effects of the geographical environment on the emotions and behaviors of individuals. For those estates, seen as sites of belonging, both horror interpretations and nostalgic memories are states of being influenced by collective psychology. Steve McQueen's film Occupied City, about the lives of Dutch Jews in Amsterdam during the Holocaust, shows how racism can dictate how geographies get earmarked for demolition by the powerful. In the same way, McQueen links the ghosts of the past to the present day sites in the city, many of them demolished. Horror might illustrate what could be possible if we thought about present day sites, present day heritage sites, and how they fit into Victorian adaptations, almost like shadow texts. Basically, how ghosts live in those buildings, imitate how those novels were written in the absence as the ghost of colonial history, dependent on us to suspend all logical belief systems for the power of the story of escapism. So the film's questions make me think about a possible Black British ghost studies, like how he raises the spectres of the Holocaust through geography, using horror to animate the country house, and slave compensation and the slave compensation records would take us back into that Black psychogeography as well, that ultimately bends the tropes of how we remember and relate to the past, with time also as fluid. When you go to the big houses, you hear the silence. These buildings are alive to the violence that happened. Mainly for my own benefit, I started to refer to this feeling as anthropomorphic whiteness, to give words to how historical objects like buildings may be charged with human-made white racism. It meshes English literature with critical whiteness studies, and I like to think about colonialism and empire, in terms of the closer you are to the source, the less you see. So anthropomorphism is a term I found found was introduced to through poetry. So it's when you give um, um, inanimate objects human traits in that sense, and you see it a lot in creative writing, especially poetry. And poetry is a poetical device. Um, um, so in the UK, we are in the place the money went. So our experience is of the gloss. But going to India, Jamaica, Ghana, and even the US, you will see the remnants of the terror of colonialism. So in some ways, I think about Doctor Who's weeping angels. They are still while you're looking, and then you blink, touched by whiteness. So the present is always intruded upon by an ever restless past. There are ancestral spirits influencing us, not all of them good. So in those buildings, ghosts of enslavers and enslaved are part of the land. The white women, especially in the colonial afterlife of Jane Austen, George Eliot, and other of these Victorian authors who used those sorts of sites. Um, Guy Debord's psychography is incredibly relevant as well for making the links between whiteness, gender, and space used to harm people of color, while at the same time showing how my life has been complicated as someone who grew up in close association with the rural England and those symbols of Englishness as well. Um, so I bring this back to me here in Northamptonshire as a child of both the town and the rural. Um, and black people have been in Britain since Roman times. There were Moors from northern Africa, part of the Roman army, including a division near Carlisle by Hadrian's Wall. Skipping to the year 1205, local researchers found there was a mandate from King John to the Constable of Northampton to retain a person called Peter the Saracen, the maker of crossbows, and another with him for the king's service, and allow him I think it's 9 pence a day. Um, Fremantle from the 26th of July, 1205. The word Saracen was often used to describe someone of North African or Middle Eastern heritage or origin, and or people who were Muslim. We do not know if Peter the Saracen was a black man, but his existence in 1205 is the earliest presence of a black person we know of in Northamptonshire, and that was in a county that was and still is incredibly rural. Terry Braysher also points out similarly that there was also Roger Le Turc, maybe of Middle Eastern origin as well, in Toaster Village. Later on, there were several enslaved black people and servants to white families from the 16th century onwards. We know there was a black presence in Castle Ashby, Rockingham, and Guilsborough and Gretton, out towards Corby. You begin to get a sense or a history of black lives in the sticks, which comes to shadow my story in local comes to shadow my story in local villages as well. So horror has potential to commentate on the world they lived in as much as it can their white employers, including people like Lady Rockingham, through invoices, checkbooks, banknotes, haunted by whiteness as eternal. In 1663, James Chappell went into the service of the Hattons at Kirby Hall in Gretton, near Corby. He also followed his employer, Sir Christopher Hatton, to Guernsey in 1670, when he was made governor of the island. On Guernsey, James lived at Cornet Castle with the family. And it was here, on the 29th of December, 1672, that lightning struck the castle, setting the gunpowder alight, starting an explosive fire. James saved the several members of the family from the rubble. Northants Black History Association also found Chappell's testimony from the event, which I won't go into here, but if anyone is interested, I can send it to you in an email. Hatton died in Hatton died in 1706, but in his will gave James £20 per year for the rest of his life. This allowed James Chappell to settle as a free man in Gretton Village with his wife Elizabeth, presumably a white woman. Elizabeth died in 1704, and James remarried again in 1705 to a Mercy Peach. It's this marriage that right in rural Northamptonshire gives scope to another legend surrounding James, namely that he became the landlord of the Hatton Arms pub in Gretton, becoming the first black publican in Northamptonshire. Apparently, there's no evidence to corroborate this, but it's interesting all the same and would work really well in a creative writing context of horror and history. The Profant Black History Association uncovered lots of evidence of black lives in the countryside locally during the 16th and 17th centuries, which ultimately would make interesting sites for horror films and TV programs, thinking about the rural as well. Seeing the ways debates of Britain's countryside today gets both sides heated, the experiences of racism clashing with the countryside as a place of some people think belongs to them, we see the present is always intruded upon by an ever restless past. There are ancestral spirits influencing us, not all of them good. Thinking how heritage is 90% white and 60% women, and 66% women. White women navigating those sites in the colonial afterlife of Jane Austen is vital when we think about how ancestors stay influencing us, and so on. Black British horror now has an opportunity to think about their role in, I guess, anti-racist education. I often think about the horror about the monsters like the weeping angels from Doctor who move when you're not looking at them. Seeing as these white people are never looking at colonial history, and don't want to look at this racism and so on. What might a monster like that look like on a country estate where you do find lots of statues everywhere? There are other stories, there are other forces at play. Whiteness as death, racism upon the spirit, whiteness and racism working across time, ancestral time as well. So you might think of historic spaces, pass these energies from places into people. So next time you go to one of those estates, you might think of the nice white ladies of the nice white ladies of the lake. How about that, Karen? They might bite you and smile red. And thanks very much for listening as well. And if you've got questions, you can send them to me in an email, treyventour.com/contact as well. And if you just got comments, just leave them in the comment section. Thanks very much.